Soy Jesús Romero, soy de la Comunidad de Sant'Egidio y para mí es una grandísima alegría dar la bienvenida en nuestra casa esta tarde a doña Rita Prigmore, que es una gran amiga de Sant'Egidio desde hace un tiempo, una persona que ha pasado por la grandísima dificultad de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, del Holocausto, tanto ella como su familia, y estamos especialmente contentos y os damos la bienvenida de que estéis esta tarde, por estar esta tarde con nosotros, sobre todo porque yo quería decir dos cosas, ¿no? Una es, la Comunidad de Sant'Egidio, como muchos de vosotros sabéis, es una comunidad católica que trabaja en favor de la paz, de la reconciliación y ayudando a los pobres de muchas partes del mundo, ¿no? Y esto que hacemos esta tarde no es una actividad cultural, digamos, como el que va a oír una conferencia, que va a ser muy interesante, sino que se inscribe dentro de lo que es la esencia misma de Sant'Egidio. Este año cumplimos 25 años en Madrid, y Sant'Egidio empezó en Madrid, en el barrio de Pan Bendito, que para los que seáis de Madrid es un barrio donde hay muchas dificultades, donde las familias pasan por momentos a veces muy complicados, y donde allí en Pan Bendito encontramos desde el principio muchísimas familias gitanas, muchísimas familias a las que empezamos a acompañar, a ayudar a los niños, a ayudarles en la vida cotidiana. Y por eso para nosotros la amistad con Rita es una amistad que viene también desde hace 25 años por esta amistad con los niños y niñas y las familias gitanas del barrio de Pan Bendito. También por eso el que esté ella aquí con nosotros hoy nos da idea del gran sufrimiento que ha tenido el pueblo gitano en Auschwitz, en Birkenau y en tantos campos de concentración, en un holocausto, en un genocidio del que poco se ha hablado. Por eso, sin más, os doy la bienvenida, damos la bienvenida a Rita y nos disponemos a escucharla. Muchas gracias.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rita Prigmore. I'm a gypsy from Würzburg, Germany, and I'm glad to speak to you today. I was born 1943 in Würzburg, Germany, in a time when many gypsies had already been deported to Auschwitz or other dead camps. How my mother and I survived, I want to tell you our story. When I look at the story of my own gypsy family in Germany, I have to acknowledge that before National Socialism, our people was much more integrated in the normal life of the population than today. My grandfather and his two brothers were basket makers. They were part of the Basket Makers Guild, and they had a very good profession. Baskets were needed in Würzburg for the wine growers. My grandfather and his family lived in Lohr, a town near Würzburg. They lived on a large piece of land with willow trees that they needed for the baskets. Many gypsies had been living in Germany for a long time and were very well integrated. Many had good professions or fought as soldiers in the First World War. Others traveled around and sold the merchandise that they had produced. I am from a family of musicians. My mother, Teresa Winterstein, was a gifted dancer and singer. During the day, she worked in a candy factory, and in the evening, she performed as a singer and dancer in the Würzburg Theatre. My father, Gabriel Reinhardt, came from Stuttgart. He had a music band. There were 7 musicians in it, very good musicians. They performed in several theatres and hotels. They were very successful. The year 1933, when Hitler came to power, was the beginning of the gradual exclusion of both the Jews and the Gypsies, and the eventual deportation to the dead camps like Auschwitz. In 1933, about 26,000 Gypsies and Romas lived in Germany. In 1934, a so-called Gypsy Center was established in Munich, whose task was to carry out measures against the Gypsies. The members of a so-called Gypsy Roids were either to be directly driven out of Germany or to be compelled to leave because they no longer were allowed to work. In October the 1st, 1938, the Gypsy Center was transferred to Berlin, renamed to the Center for the Fight Against Gypsydom, and made a part of the Reich's Central Criminal Police Service. Its task was to identify all gypsies. In fact, we gypsies were all German citizens and had not been previously registered as gypsies before. They established a research center on race hygiene and population biology in 1936. From then on, they began to register, measure, and photograph all gypsies and Roma. The SS believed that one feature of the gypsies was criminality already in their genetics and called us antisocial personalities. Their research, therefore, involved analyzing the shape of the nose, the ears, and taking blood samples. The Romas were registered as foreigners. We gypsies were Germans. This also happened to my family. My father was arrested in 1936 along with his brothers, as well as my mother. My mother lived in Lohr with her parents. 1938, the Gestapo came to my grandfather's family. The piece of land and the house were taken, and my family were told to leave. They were then brought to a 1.5-room flat apartment in Würzburg. My family consisted of my grandfather, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my uncle, which means 5 people who had to share a 1.5-room. From that moment onward, they were no longer allowed to leave the city of Würzburg. In 1942, when almost all German Jews had already been deported and murdered, the eventual fate of the German gypsies was not clear yet. However, the Nazis wanted to prevent them from procreating. Therefore, the law for the prevention of genetically ill offspring was applied to the gypsies. The diagnosis often was half-breed or antisocial. What they had planned was the sterilization of all gypsies in Germany. Whoever was not ready to be sterilized was taken to Auschwitz. That was the only alternative, which meant death. They also took my mother from her apartment. The Nazis faced her with a choice: either go to Auschwitz or sign a paper with the following conditions: have no relationship with a man, and she must not become pregnant. My mother told me how scared she was to sign the paper, that she did not know what it all meant and what they eventually would do to her. In 1942, before the appointment for sterilization, my mother became pregnant. She had to inform the Gestapo about this. She was summoned and they wanted to perform an abortion. But during the examination, they noticed that she was pregnant with twins, Rolanda and me. She was again made to sign a paper that she would hand us children over to the Nazis for studies or be deported to Auschwitz. The sterilization was postponed until after our birth. My mother was examined several times in the Würzburg University Hospital by Dr. Heide, a student of Dr. Mengeles. Dr. Mengele was the ruthless twin researcher and later camp doctor of the Gypsy family camp in Auschwitz. His specialties were gypsy twins. Mengele was a genetic who had made his objective to breed a race of blonde and blue-eyed Aryans. Until that time, only animal experiments had been allowed, but then experiments on humans were carried out in many hospitals and especially in such camps as Auschwitz. These experiments were also carried out on my sister and me. The doctor who carried out these experiments was Dr. Heide. He was also responsible for planning the execution, the so-called T4 measures, to kill disabled and physically ill people, as Hitler had decided. Dr. Heide signed a death warrant for about 100,000 residents of homes for disabilities and people in psychiatric clinics. My sister, Rolanda, and I were born on the 3rd of March, 1943. My mother told me that 4 doctors in uniforms were present at our birth. They took the children away from her immediately, and she was only allowed to see us after 5 days. After a week, my mother fled with us 2 girls from the hospital. She was afraid that everyone else in her family would have been deported to Auschwitz in the meantime. In fact, in April 1943, almost all gypsies were deported to Auschwitz. The 2 of us were allowed to remain with my mother for a short time. Then she had to take us back to the hospital, allegedly because of malnutrition. We stayed in the hospital and she was not allowed to visit us. After 2 weeks, my mother could not stand it any longer. She went to the hospital to see us. After my mother had been asked several times, one of the nurses showed her only 1 child, me. My mother asked, "Where is the other child?" The nurse led her to the bathroom, where Rolanda was lying in the bathtub with a shirt, a bandage around her head. She was dead. My mother panicked, ran out of the room into the children's department, and took me out of my bed. Then she told my grandfather we'll meet at the meeting point, which was St. Rita's Chapel. She ran out of the hospital. I had a Band-Aid on my head. My mother went to St. Rita Chapel with me and had me baptized under emergency conditions on the name of Rita. She then went home, where the SS was already waiting. They left me with my mother for 2 more days. Then they took me again. For 1 year, my mother did not know where I was. Then she received a letter from the Red Cross that she could pick me up. That was in the year 1944, 1 year later. For a long time, I did not know what happened to me. My mother did not tell me because she didn't want to burden me. I was a very sickly child. I often fainted. I went to school, but I was very sick and weak. I was freed from the obligation to go to school because of a physical default. Dr. Heide had performed experiments on me and my sister to do research on how to change the color of our eyes. This is why we got injections in our heads and behind our eyes. I have a scar behind my right eye. Dr. Heide was taken prisoner after the war and was meant to be convicted at the Nuremberg trials. On the way there, he managed to flee. He then worked undisturbed as a doctor for 10 more years, until he was discovered. My mother was sterilized after our birth. Kurt, my mother's older brother, was in a motorbike squad that escorted Hitler on his travels. As he was a good soldier, they wanted to promote him to a degree of an officer. They carried out an ancestral research and noticed that his parents were gypsies. He was immediately discharged and was to go from Lyon, France to Würzburg in order to be sterilized at the age of 25. My grandfather and many of my family who had not been deported to Auschwitz were also sterilized. In 1943, the great deportation of Sintis and Romas to Auschwitz began. Many from my family were deported and died in Auschwitz. Once you arrived there, after a ride of several days without food and water, you were no longer a human person. You were only a number. From February until 1943, 18,736 Gypsies and Romas from Germany and the occupied areas were taken to Birkenau and registered. In total, there were about 23,000 Gypsies in the camp. It is estimated that about 500,000 Gypsies and Romas were murdered during the Third Reich. Last year I went to Auschwitz for the first time, which was not easy for me, as many of my people from my family were killed in Auschwitz. Alone from Würzburg and the surrounding area, there were 300. Ladies and gentlemen, I often ask myself again and again, where does discrimination come from? Why do these horrible things happen to human beings who have done nothing except for looking different or belonging to another race? Do we not all belong to the same human race without difference? Certainly we are different. We have different eye colors, different hair. We think different and have different lifestyles. When you are asked, where do you come from? Suddenly everything changes. Then you are no longer the person they know. Then you are a Jew, a Gypsy, a Pole, a Czech, a Turk or a Muslim, or some other minority. Where does it come from that you suddenly lose your right as a human being? When somebody hears that you are a Gypsy, I believe that only God, who created us, has the right to decide our destiny or to judge us. Our wish is to integrate in every country. We Gypsies do not have a country of our own, and we do not strive for it. Therefore, we want to live as fully fledged citizens of the country in which we live. It is the strong wish of our people to integrate ourselves in the country we live in. We want that our children visit schools to obtain good graduation. We want that our youth have good education chances and perspective for a dignified life. We want to be fully fledged citizens in the countries where we have been living for generations, yes, even centuries. We Gypsies want to work and live in dignity. Dear friends, together we have to fight against any racism and to commit ourselves. Therefore, I am very happy to talk at this meeting. I am very grateful that the community of Sant'Egidio invited me to speak to 500 young people from the Western European countries in Auschwitz last July, and to more than 1,300 young people from the Eastern countries in September. I see it as my task not to remain silent, but to tell my story so that a new generation of young people grows up, which has respect for every human being, and to know that any kind of prejudice can end up in a catastrophe like Auschwitz. I'm convinced that together we will be able to build a society in Europe and in the world in which Gypsies and all other minorities are no longer discriminated, but can live in a dignified and free way, without fear, by realizing that it is a treasure when people who are different living together. Living together is our future. Thank you.